Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by AUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Meade of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.
Hello everyone, this is RealTalk USA on 105.3 Afro FM and it's me, EUL, with...
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Real Talk USA this afternoon on 105.3 Afro FM. This is Ms. Gabwa from the U.S. Mission to the African Union, and today's show is going to air a telephonic press briefing that was hosted by the Africa Media Hub on Tuesday this week, featuring Mr. Richard Glenn, who's the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the U.S. State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. We'll be hearing Mr. Glenn discuss wildlife trafficking and transnational crime in Africa and the efforts of the government of the United States to halt this crime. This is an internationally recognized crime. As most of you may know, the United Nations General Assembly proclaimed March 3rd as UN World Wildlife Day to celebrate and raise awareness of the world's wild animals and plants. This year's theme is Big Cats, Predators Under Threat, and the UN website states that the big cats are among the most widely recognized and admired animals across the globe, but that today these charismatic predators are facing many and varied threats, which are mostly caused by human activities. Overall, their numbers are declining at a disturbing rate due to a loss of habitat and prey, conflicts with people, poaching, and illegal trade. Mr. Glenn will be talking about the illegal trade aspect of this matter in today's Real Talk program and will explore in greater detail the current issues. Wildlife trafficking threatens not only wildlife but also national and global security. It fuels corruption, insecurity, instability, it weakens border security and undermines the rule of law in places where government structures are already weak. Wildlife trafficking strengthens violent criminal organizations who leverage proceeds from this low-risk, high-reward crime into other illegal activities such as drug trafficking. It is estimated that environmental crimes generate around $40 billion in revenue for criminals each year. It is for these reasons that the State Department works together with partners from around the world to find solutions to end the death and destruction affecting not only elephants but also rhinos, tigers, and countless other species around the world. To say a few words about Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Richard Glenn and what he does, he oversees the department's air wing and is responsible for foreign assistance programs in the Western Hemisphere, programs comprising of an annual appropriation of more than $500 million with programs in more than 20 countries administered by more than 1,000 employees and contractors. Mr. Glenn is a graduate of Brigham Young Academy and he speaks Spanish and Czech. He's a native of the Golden State, the state of California. And with that, let's turn it over to Mr. Richard Glenn.
Well, thank you, and good morning from Washington. It's about 8 o'clock in the morning here. Thank you for the opportunity to meet with you all by phone to discuss what I think is one of the most important areas in which our Bureau, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, works on. Wildlife trafficking is a multi-billion-dollar organized crime activity and obviously a critical conservation issue. It pushes many of the iconic and some not so iconic species to the brink of extinction. It restricts economic development, it threatens security and stability, and certainly undermines the rule of law. Stopping wildlife trafficking is a priority for the U.S. government. The President Trump has made it a priority in his executive order on combating transnational organized crime. And the U.S. Congress has made it, for many years, a priority. And our Bureau, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, which I help lead, plays a key role in the development and the implementation of anti-wildlife trafficking policies around the world. And in many respects, wildlife trafficking is not terribly different from other violent and destructive, bloody and profitable criminal enterprises. Our Bureau has found that the tools and resources that we developed helping fight other forms of trafficking and other forms of organized crime can also be very helpful and can be applied to the wildlife arena. We bring decades worth of experience, which we develop mostly by countering transnational criminal organizations that traffic in drugs. The resources that are at our disposal to combat wildlife trafficking have grown, fortunately, have grown exponentially from less than $100,000 5 years ago to now $50 million this year. As we all know, organized crime cares little for national borders. They don't follow the same set of rules that we do. And it's up to all of us to work internationally to stop not only poaching, but also the movement of illegal wildlife goods. And if these criminals, if these organizations that conduct this activity can't find safe haven for their destructive, bloody activities in one jurisdiction, they're certain to move on to another that's more permissible. So it's important that we all band together to fight this. With this in mind, we certainly strive to help partner nations in Africa, Southeast Asia, and in the Americas to improve their enforcement, their investigative skills, prosecutorial capabilities, and their legislative capacities. And we encourage, obviously, cooperation within and across governments. Now, to date, our training efforts have reached just over 2,000 justice sector officials throughout the world who combat wildlife trafficking, including conservation law enforcement officers. And our work on the African continent spans multiple subregions, including East, Central, and Southern Africa. In Africa alone, we've provided survival, surveillance, and investigative equipment and training to rangers in over 20 parks in 8 countries. And in many cases, this has included emergency medical training to increase the odds that rangers survive the violent encounters that they often have with poachers. We're also working to build connections between source regions of Africa, Latin America, and Asia for wildlife products with the demand countries. We do this by funding exchange visits and joint training to build trust, exchange information, and eventually take down what we hope will be entire networks of traffickers instead of just individual poachers. We support research to ensure that we have the most up-to-date information about the scope of wildlife trade around the world. One example is we've commissioned new research into the illicit trade in wildlife products, including pangolins, which is the world's most trafficked mammal. And if I could, I just want to mention a few of the results, of the positive results of the work that we're doing. Through one of the INL-funded agreements that we have with the World Customs Organization, customs officials from 10 African countries collaborated on Operation Save Rep, or rhinos, elephants, and pangolins. And it resulted in the seizure of over 80 kilograms of rhino horn, 540 kilograms of ivory, and 64 kilograms of pangolin scales. And the operation was a culmination of the World Customs Organization's phased training to combat wildlife trafficking, which included training on enforcement, intelligence, and operation planning. And of course, we will continue our work with WCO, with the World Customs Organization, to build interdiction capacity in Africa and expand that training into Southeast Asia. Recognizing that the ability to bring criminals to justice is another key component in the fight against wildlife trafficking, INL, we also fund programs that help build justice sector capacity. For example, a Tanzanian prosecutor who participated in an INL-funded United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime training program recently used what he learned to successfully prosecute 2 people charged with trafficking over $1.3 million worth of illegal ivory. And thanks to this training, the individuals were given us an especially lengthy prison sentence that reflects the seriousness of their crimes. It's a pleasure for us to be working in this field. the U.S. government will continue to lead global efforts to end the gruesome trafficking of elephants, rhinos, and many of the other endangered species throughout the world. And we certainly stand ready to work together with more partner nations in this effort. I wanted to thank all of you for joining us this morning, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Glenn. We will now begin the question and answer portion of today's call. For those asking questions, please state your name and affiliation and limit yourself to one question related to the topic of today's briefing, wildlife trafficking in Africa and U.S. efforts to halt this crime. Our first question will go to the listening party in Addis Ababa.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Lul from Cape Herald newspaper. I have two questions. First one is that in what way you are supporting peasants who are living around the wildlife areas? This is the first one. And the other one is the Chinese workers who are engaged in infrastructure activities are using the opportunity to hunt wildlife. So in what way this can be prevented? Thank you very much.
I think obviously the conditions and economic conditions in the countries in which wildlife trafficking occurs, where the production or the acquisition of the animals occurs, is obviously an important aspect of why wildlife trafficking occurs. Much like drug trafficking and the production of drugs, it is incumbent upon the countries where this occurs to focus on those areas. The United States government works with several agencies, including USAID and the Peace Corps, to focus on increasing economic opportunities for those individuals. In our bureau, we focus on the law enforcement end of the solution, helping to increase the capacity of law enforcement to protect those animals, and to work with prosecutors and customs officials to prevent the export and movement of the wildlife.
Thank you. Our next question will go to the U.S. Embassy, Lusaka, Zambia, for a question.
Yeah, my name is Francis Lungu. I represent the Zambia Daily Mail. My question is looking at what you've outlined in terms of capacity building, finances and training that you are offering to a number of African countries. I would like to find out whether you have a monitoring mechanism to see to it that those capacities that you are offering are really working out in these African countries.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and it's an area that we are focusing on. So doing the monitoring and the evaluation of the programs to see what kind of impact that they are having. We certainly do not want to spend U.S. taxpayer money and use up the time of partner nation individuals and officials if the programs are not effective. So as we begin to implement this sizable amount of resource that has now been given to us to work with throughout the world, a monitoring and evaluation program that will evaluate the impacts of our work is a key part of going forward.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Luz Razafimbello of Midi Madagascar from Madagascar. He asks, what is your assessment of the enforcement of environmental justice in general in Africa and in particular in Madagascar?
I think there are some very encouraging signs that we're seeing throughout the continent. The fact that we're even having this call to discuss the issue and the topic is important. The role of the media in Africa is going to be key in order for our efforts, for our common efforts to take hold. Specifically in Madagascar, we recognize that globally the environmental crime is not always taken as seriously as crimes like drug trafficking or murder or other types of crime. But we certainly recognize, and we hope others recognize, that the illicit trade in wildlife, including parts, products, and live animals, both imported and exported from countries, including the United States, serve as a valuable source of revenue for transnational criminal organizations. What our fight is really about is rooting out those organizations that do not respect the rule of law, that increase the amount of corruption that occurs in countries, and really limit the economic opportunities because of that corruption.
Thank you. Our next question will go to Kevin Kelly from Nation Media Group. He's based in New York.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for doing this today. So you've been speaking about the organized crime element in terms of wildlife trafficking. I wonder if you can also address trafficking on the part of violent extremist groups. I'd like to know from you whether you have any evidence that such groups such as Al-Shabaab in Somalia and various rebel groups in South Sudan are benefiting in any way from poaching, from wildlife trafficking. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. I think I have not seen. I'll tell you what I've seen and what I've not seen. I have not seen anything that indicates a direct link between wildlife trafficking and extremist groups. However, we do know that extremist groups do fund their activities, much of their activity through typical types of transnational organized crime, including drug trafficking. It is certainly possible and would not be beyond the realm for them to have engaged in wildlife trafficking.
Thank you. Our next question will go to the listening party in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Thank you very much. I am Kiran Taddese. I work with Afro FM 105.3 in Addis Ababa. Mr. Richard, you are mentioning about a research that you conducted. Can you tell me specific statistics that you have, particularly with Ethiopia, if your research has something to say about this, especially in wildlife trafficking? And I would also like to know your opinion about the rationale behind putting on fire those confiscated, for instance, ivories. Traditionally, confiscated ivories would be put on fire, and I don't see the rationale behind. And I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you very much.
So, thank you for the question. In terms of burning ivory, I think that is a choice made by law enforcement organizations in each of the countries. I would imagine that in their view, destroying the product as opposed to putting it out on the market is a form of decreasing the demand or decreasing the supply of the ivory to prevent it from getting into the market and encouraging further purchasing. In terms of research, there are several avenues of research that we help fund, whether it be into the pangolin trade or DNA research on identifying where elephant ivory is coming from. That research helps us to identify which networks are trafficking in which ivory, and helping to identify the actual individuals and groups that are conducting the illegal activity, and allows us to share that information with law enforcement partners in those countries to better get an idea of or map out the criminal organizations that we're helping to fight against. Thanks for the question.
Our next question will go to Anita Powell, Southern African correspondent for Voice of America.
Hello. Forgive me if you've already addressed this in your opening remarks. I'm just looking at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's memo allowing limited importation of wildlife trophies into the United States. I just want to know, is that making your mission more difficult or less difficult? And maybe it's a little early because this was just issued in March, but what trends have you seen in response to that memo? Have you seen an increase or really anything notable since the department put out that memo?
A great question, and I think the jury is still out. I think we need to, in terms of how it affects our work, we I don't think there's been sufficient time for that policy decision to have shown any trend one way or the other. What I will say, though, is that in terms of what the State Department focuses on and what we in INL focus on is attacking those criminal networks that propagate this illicit industry of wildlife trafficking. So we will continue to do everything that we can, regardless of decisions made by other agencies, to continue to attack. And in fact, Fish and Wildlife Service here in the United States is a critical partner in sharing best practices in terms of law enforcement practices against wildlife trafficking. So we will continue to work with them and with other U.S. government and international agencies to stem the tide of wildlife trafficking. Thanks for the question.
Our next question was sent in from the listening party in Namibia. It comes from Donald Mathies, the Namibian economist. He asks, are you seeing positive changes in wildlife trafficking in African countries, particularly in Namibia?
Again, I would say that we are seeing positive responses from those that we are working with. I think we're certainly not starting from zero, but we're starting from many countries having a very basic approach to fighting wildlife trafficking. But what we have seen is a response to the training that we and others have offered, and working on legislation and training of law enforcement officers, like I said, prosecutors, to be able to go out and seize and take away the product that these organizations are trying to market and sell throughout the world. So I think that we have a long ways to go, obviously, before we can claim any kind of victory. And we, not just the U.S. government, but we as a community that care about wildlife trafficking. But I would say that the World Customs Organization operation, the one that I mentioned earlier, SaveRep, has helped us engage in Namibia and was a key partner with the Namibians in seizing a large portion of the products that have been seized.
Thank you. Our next question will go to the listening party at the U.S. Embassy, Lusaka, Zambia.
Hello, I'm Doreen Liwanga from Roots FM Radio. I just want to find out how you make a distinction between what you are calling wildlife trafficking and a person who is hunting down animals for consumption. Thank you.
So the difference between wildlife trafficking is we view as a transnational organized crime problem, where individuals are feeding a market or participating in organized crime that feeds an international market and seeks to circumvent laws of the country that they are residing in, as well as countries where the product is destined for. So I would say that that's the distinction, is the difference between someone hunting to feed themselves and someone who is hunting to profit off of the trade of wildlife.
Thank you. Our next question will go to Molly Peterson, a reporter for National Public Radio, KQED in San Francisco.
Thank you. Last year, I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in North Kivu, where I met people, including park rangers in Virunga, among others, who were seeking to improve criminal prosecution and combat wildlife trafficking domestically in the DRC with the support of an INL-funded program. And it's my understanding that INL is seeking to end its portion of support for this program in the DRC. If that's accurate, can you tell me how ending this DRC program would fit in with your overall mission?
I certainly don't believe that we're ending that program. In fact, with the amount of resources that are now available to us, thanks to Congress, and to the president's focus on wildlife trafficking, we're actually looking at expanding those programs. I think it's important, especially the program that you've mentioned. We can go out and train park rangers on how to stop poachers, but really what it's going to be about is do these countries have the capability, and do their prosecutors and their judges have the skills needed to actually prosecute these individuals and apply some kind of dissuasive penalty for their activity. So we're going to continue in those programs and do as much as we can to help places like the DRC, which is a hard space to work in. But we will continue our work there.
Just a quick follow-up. Are you saying that you might expand or add funding to this program?
It's a possibility. We're certainly looking into it.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our next question will go to the listening party in the U.S. Embassy, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Thank you. I'm Ishara Abdullah from Ghana Television in Ethiopia. Just want to confirm that there isn't enough information that concludes or shows wild trafficking being used in funding criminal groups, specifically in East Africa and in Ethiopia. So can you tell us if there's any findings that shows this trend, or what kind of criminal groups are using this activity to fund their group, specifically in Ethiopia? Thank you.
So I don't have a specific list of criminal organizations in Ethiopia, but what we do recognize is that there are networks throughout the world that traffic and trade in animals, and in many cases, these organizations feed the same corruption that corrupts governments throughout the world. And so, much like drug trafficking or human trafficking, wildlife trafficking has the same, and those who run wildlife trafficking, their ability to corrupt the governments in which they operate, all the way from a lower level park ranger, all the way up to customs officials and beyond. That's what we're really looking at here in terms of the assistance that we're trying to give, is to help root out those organizations that fight against the establishment and abiding of the rule of law. Thanks for your question.
Our next question was submitted in advance from Wangai Sangaza from the Zimbabwe Independent newspaper. He asks, from the analysis and research you have done, what is the extent of Zimbabwe's wildlife trafficking, and who are the main culprits involved? How much worth is Zimbabwe losing as a result of wildlife trafficking annually?
So I don't have a specific number on Zimbabwe, and I don't know that we've done that kind of research. But I think I could speak a little bit about our ability to understand the criminal networks and the impact that they have. I mentioned earlier the work that we've done in DNA forensics that's given us great insight into ivory trafficking networks. Some of that obviously touches Zimbabwe, and it's actually work being done by a Dr. Sam Wasser at the University of Washington here in the United States, and his work has shown the connectivity of many of the major ivory trafficking operators in Africa, and shown that these are not loosely associated individuals, but they are highly organized and professional cartels that are controlling the trafficking routes. And then, of course, these cartels are then linked with major poaching operations that take place in Africa. So, the pieces that are specific to Zimbabwe, we would have to get back to the gentleman and get him a more specific answer.
Thank you. Our next question came in from the listening party in Maputo, Mozambique. How is the U.S. government responding to increasing elephant poaching rates, particularly in less developed and protected areas like the Niassa National Reserve in Mozambique?
I would refer back to the answer that I just provided on the research that our colleague at the University of Washington is doing. That kind of research is key to helping to prevent or to map out the criminal organizations and to better allow host governments to focus their resources on those networks. We've also worked specifically in the Niassa National Reserve on wildlife mapping software, and this technology allows rangers to map wildlife and poaching incidents in real time, and it allows them to better deploy their resources in the Niassa National Reserve to protect wildlife and with the intent to deter poaching. We've also provided $2 million worth of equipment through the African Parks Network and the WCS to help in those efforts.
Thank you. We have a question from Kevin Kelly from Nation Media Group, please.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity again. So just following up on what the Voice of America colleague asked earlier regarding Fish and Wildlife Service memo on elephant trophies. Various environmental groups, including in Kenya, think this is a really negative development, that it really suggests that the United States is no longer playing the leadership role it once played. The Obama administration had a different, more stringent policy in terms of showing the way towards protecting endangered species, protecting species that are very vulnerable to poaching, such as elephant. What do you say to those groups' objections? How do you respond to those concerns? Thanks.
I think at least in terms of the areas that the State Department has a role in, specifically in our Bureau and International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, the administration, the Trump administration, through an executive order on combating transnational organized crime, specifically calls out wildlife trafficking and points to it as a major source of instability and of criminal behavior that has a negative impact on developing countries as well as developed countries who are primarily the consumers of it. So I would not agree that the U.S. has lost its lead. In fact, under the Trump administration, we are aggressively going out. As I mentioned in the opening, we now have $50 million this year to assist countries in their law enforcement and rule of law efforts to combat this problem. So, I would defer you to Fish and Wildlife Service on that specific trophy hunting question. But in terms of what the State Department does and the direction that we've received from the Trump administration, our goals and objectives are very clear, and that is to stop wildlife trafficking.
Thank you. Our next question will go to the listening party, the U.S. Embassy in Lusaka, Zambia.
Hello, my name is Juba Zulu. I am from Sioux Newspaper. I just wanted to find out, in your opening remarks, you mentioned that mostly the the wildlife traffickers usually overlook the national borders, meaning that they use other means. So I'd like to find out from you, as you work with Research Support and the World Customs Organization, what do you think should be done to curb these vices? We know that they don't use national borders. Thank you.
I think there's a tremendous amount of work that we can do. I think harmonization of laws and rules and regulations is certainly helpful, and that's why we work on legislative fixes or legislative initiatives in countries in order to harmonize laws. In many cases, just to recognize wildlife trafficking as a crime that is punishable, where we can imprison or where those countries can imprison people for wildlife trafficking, where assets, money, goods, the tools used for wildlife trafficking can be seized and hopefully then converted back into funds and resources for the governments that are fighting this problem. The criminal organizations have no respect for the rule of law. And in order for us to be successful, we need to harmonize our efforts to get laws that are compatible with each other, and be able to attack these organizations and beat them back.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Matteo Ramisi Arisolo of Taratra Daily in Madagascar. He asks, almost every month, the local media in Madagascar reports on tortoise and primate trafficking. What measures does the U.S. take to ban trafficking of wildlife? Is there any kind of collaboration to help countries in Africa, such as Madagascar, given the insufficient maritime security control?
It's a great question. And the United States, at least by the numbers that we have, is likely the second or third largest consumer of wildlife products, including the turtles that are referred to. The Fish and Wildlife Service here in the United States has responsibility for policies and the enforcement of those policies and laws as the federal enforcement agency. We are a party to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, or CITES. And as a party to the convention, the United States carefully monitors the trade in endangered species, including into and out of the United States. And so with the Fish and Wildlife Service, they have special agents living abroad. They are now regional attachés in some of our embassies, and they work to help enforce wildlife laws and assist countries who need help in protecting their wildlife. There's an interesting law that was passed back in 1900, and it's the Lacey Act, and it's a conservation law in the United States, which makes it a federal crime to break wildlife laws. And this means that the Fish and Wildlife Service can enforce the environmental laws of partner nations at U.S. borders, and this obviously strengthens the global enforcement of wildlife laws. So if a country like Madagascar passes laws to protect their primates and tortoises, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife finds those protected primates and tortoises in the United States, it can arrest and prosecute the violators on behalf of Madagascar.
Thank you. Our next question was sent in from the listening party in Windhoek. Donald Matthews from Namibia Economist asks, what methods does State INL encourage African governments to use to combat wildlife trafficking?
They're innumerable. There's a lot that can be done, and like I said earlier, from the very the bottom of the triangle up to the top. So the bottom being your law enforcers who are out in the field, out physically doing the physical work of protecting the wildlife. So increasing the skills that they have to do their jobs. In many cases, the desire to do their jobs is not lacking. In many cases, it's just the training and the equipping. Being able to give them something as simple as infrared equipment or night vision equipment that allows them to do their jobs at night when many of the poachers are active. Giving them GPS mapping capabilities, survival equipment. The next rung up then is the investigative capabilities and the prosecutorial capabilities within our partner countries, giving them the ability and the tools to properly investigate, and the moral backing to do their jobs. And then at the top of the pyramid, the judicial sector that. In many cases, these countries are prosecuting wildlife crimes for wildlife crime is not a well-established part of their judicial practice. So getting judges trained on what is permissible, what they can prosecute people on. We see throughout the world in developing countries the idea of seizing assets and allowing those to be converted back into funds for the government is a fairly new concept. It's something that has been used effectively in the United States and other countries to increase the available resources to fight crime, and then to also the primary reason for that is to take away the reward of the criminal activity. And then just one other thing that I mentioned that I think is really essential, and we've mentioned it already on the call this morning, is the legislative work that needs to be done in order to have laws that are responsive to this dilemma that we're fighting in wildlife trafficking.
Thank you. Our last question today will go to the listening party in Lusaka, Zambia.
Okay, thank you. My name is Taza Siri, a freelance journalist. I'll take you back to the legislative work, and we're looking at different government structures. And Richard, you mentioned a point where you said possibly harmonizing laws in most of these regions. Is that workable? How do you look at that? Is that possible? Because we're looking at different governments, and then they also have their beliefs. And then when we look at the corruption levels are mostly in these same high offices. So is that possible to harmonize the different law structures that we have in the different countries?
It's an excellent question, and it's a question that we too ask ourselves. I think there's precedent for countries coming together to pass perhaps not the exact same laws, but laws that are in at least accordance with the international treaties to which they are party. We've seen that happen in the drug trafficking realm, in the drug trafficking conventions. That countries have passed laws and do take action in accordance with their international obligations. And so I think that there certainly is a precedent for it. But I would say because this is, while it's not a new problem, I think the focus on wildlife trafficking is becoming more acute and more intense. We will begin to see more harmonization, or at least more common adoption of laws that are that line up with international agreements and commitments that have been made. So it's going to be one of the key areas that will help lead to success.
Thank you very much. Mr. Glenn, did you have any final words for our listeners?
No, just thank you all for participating in the call this morning. As I said earlier, the participation of media and the power that you all have to bring attention to this to really the tragic loss of wildlife in a continent as beautiful and diverse as Africa. Is the work that you do is extremely important, and we appreciate your help in what I view as a common fight against wildlife trafficking and for the preservation of these animals. So thank you all for your participation. I look forward to meeting with you, if not in person, at least by phone at some point in the future.
Thank you. And that concludes today's call. I want to thank Richard Glenn, Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, for joining us, and thank all of our callers for participating.
Well, I hope this was very informative for those of you listening to us. Thank you for joining us on RealTalk USA.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time, same place, same time.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
The hour where the U.S. mission to the African Union comes to you through Afro FM 105.3 to highlight the United States partnership in Africa. Current issues will be discussed. Guests will engage on a variety of topics ranging from politics to jazz. Co-hosted by AUL Solomon of Afro FM and Chris Mead of USAU. The show will air every Thursday from 5 to 6 p.m. Feel free to participate by sending messages to the USAU social media sites, www.usau.usmission.gov or www.facebook.com/USAU, and follow USAU on twitter.com/USAU.
Just relax. Welcome to my house.
Real Talk USA.
Welcome to my house. It's my house.